Sarah had always been the kind of woman who paid attention to things other people walked past. She noticed the way a dog paused before crossing a threshold, the way old oak trees leaned slightly south in the northern hemisphere as if listening for something warmer, and the way, on the coldest mornings of February, the ground beneath a thick pile of fallen leaves was never frozen. She had been noticing that last one since she was 7 years old, crouching in her grandmother's backyard in rural Vermont, pressing her small palm flat against the earth and feeling the impossible warmth rising up through layers of decomposed matter and compressed time. Her grandmother, a woman named Elsa who had survived 2 wars and 1 great flood, and seemed to regard all 3 with roughly equal practicality, had told her that the earth was the world's oldest furnace. She said it the way she said most things, without drama, as if it were simply a fact that had been waiting for someone to bother stating it. Sarah didn't do anything with that knowledge for a long time. She went to college, studied environmental science because she felt she owed something to the world but wasn't quite sure what, got a job with a land conservation nonprofit in western Montana, fell in love with a man named Dale who played guitar badly but cooked magnificently, and bought 5 acres of sloped land in the Bitterroot Valley that came with a collapsing barn, a creek that ran dry in August, and a view of the mountains that made her feel, every single morning, like she had gotten away with something. Dale built a raised bed garden. Sarah planted a small orchard. They talked for years about building something permanent, something that wasn't the aging double-wide trailer that sat at the property's entrance and leaked cold air from its seams every time November arrived. It was Dale who first used the word earthship, though he used it loosely, the way people say off-grid, when they mean something closer to less dependent. He had been reading online, falling into the rabbit hole of alternative construction the way he fell into most things, completely and without warning, arriving at the breakfast table one morning with his laptop open and an expression she recognized as the beginning of a project. He showed her images of homes built into hillsides, their south-facing walls made almost entirely of glass, their back walls and roofs buried under several feet of earth. The temperature inside those structures, he told her, stayed remarkably stable year-round without any conventional heating system. The earth acted as a thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. The concept wasn't new. People had been using it for thousands of years in cliff dwellings and hobbit-like structures dug into hillsides across every cold weather civilization on the planet. What was new was the data, the careful measurements, the modern materials that could be combined with ancient principles to achieve something precise and reliable. Sarah looked at the images for a long time. Then she looked out the window at their sloped land and thought about her grandmother's backyard and the warm earth beneath the leaves. She told Dale she wanted to understand it properly before they built anything. She didn't want to read blog posts. She wanted to understand the physics. The physics, as she came to understand over the following months, were not complicated, though they required a certain willingness to think slowly. The earth, at a depth of roughly 6 to 8 feet, maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round regardless of the surface temperature above it. In most temperate regions of North America, this temperature hovers between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't matter whether it's July or January on the surface. 6 feet down, the Earth has already averaged out all of those extremes into something stable and moderate, a kind of geological memory of the year's total thermal experience. This is why root cellars have always worked. This is why caves feel cool in summer and warm in winter. The Earth isn't generating heat in any dramatic sense. It's storing and averaging it, acting as the world's most patient thermodynamic buffer. The challenge with using this principle for heating a home wasn't understanding it. The challenge was designing a structure that could take advantage of it without simply being cold all the time. 55 degrees is comfortable compared to -15, but nobody wants to live in 55 degrees. What Sarah and Dale were trying to achieve was something more refined, a structure that used the Earth's constant temperature as a floor, a thermal foundation below which the interior temperature would never fall, and then layered additional passive heat gain on top of that floor to bring the living space up to genuinely comfortable temperatures. The key was the sun. Their land sloped gently downward from north to south, which was, she realized with a feeling like luck, almost perfectly suited to what they needed. An earth-sheltered home built into a south-facing slope could bury its north, east, and west walls entirely underground, eliminating those walls as sources of heat loss almost entirely. The south-facing wall, exposed to the sun, could be designed to maximize solar gain in winter when the sun was low in the sky, and to minimize it in summer when the sun was high. This was basic passive solar design, decades old, well understood, but it became something more powerful when combined with earth sheltering because the combination addressed the two fundamental problems of passive solar heating simultaneously: the problem of heat loss at night and the problem of temperature swings during the day. In a conventional passive solar home with large south-facing windows, the structure gains heat rapidly when the sun shines and loses it rapidly when clouds arrive or night falls. The thermal mass inside the structure, typically concrete floors or masonry walls, helps buffer those swings, but in a cold climate it's rarely enough on its own. The structure still needs a backup heating system for the many days when the sun doesn't cooperate. But when you surround 3 sides and the roof of that same structure with 6 feet of earth, the thermal mass available to the system becomes almost incomprehensibly large. You're no longer asking a few inches of concrete floor to stabilize your interior temperature. You're asking the entire volume of earth surrounding the structure to participate in that stabilization. And earth, in volume, is extraordinarily good at it. Sarah spent a winter reading and a spring doing calculations and a summer arguing with county building officials who had never permitted an earth-sheltered structure and weren't sure they wanted to start. The arguments were not hostile so much as exhausting. She was asking them to think about something unfamiliar, and people who work in permitting offices are, for entirely reasonable professional reasons, most comfortable with the familiar. She brought engineering drawings. She brought thermal performance data from completed structures in similar climates. She brought, eventually, a structural engineer named Tom who had built 2 earth-sheltered homes in Idaho and could speak in the language of load calculations and drainage coefficients that the building department needed to hear. The permit came through in October, 18 months after Dale had opened his laptop at the breakfast table. They broke ground the following May. The excavation was the most dramatic part, the part that felt most irreversible. A machine came and carved a room out of the hillside, peeling back the earth in great curling strips and piling it to the east in a mound they would later use for landscaping. The hole was roughly 40 feet wide, 20 feet deep into the hill, and 12 feet high, and standing inside it on the first evening after the excavator left, with the raw earth walls rising on 3 sides and the open southern exposure looking out over their property and the mountains beyond, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt that the house was already there. The excavation wasn't a hole waiting to be filled. It was a space that had been waiting, specifically, for this purpose. The foundation work was careful and slow. Tom had specified a drainage system that would be, he told them without apology, the most important thing in the entire project. An earth-sheltered home lives or dies by its drainage. If water infiltrates the structure from the surrounding soil, you lose your insulation value, you invite mold, you potentially compromise your structural integrity, and you turn your beautiful thermal mass into a cold, wet problem. The drainage system they installed involved a deep gravel bed beneath the foundation slab, a series of perforated pipes that would carry any infiltrating water away from the structure and down the slope, and a waterproofing membrane on the exterior of the walls, so complete and so carefully installed that Tom inspected every seam personally and made them redo 2 sections he wasn't satisfied with. Sarah had not fully appreciated, until that point, that waterproofing a buried wall is a fundamentally different problem from waterproofing a roof, because a roof's enemy is rain, which is intermittent and directional, while a buried wall's enemy is the entire surrounding soil, which is always present and applies pressure from every direction simultaneously. The walls themselves were poured concrete, 12 inches thick, reinforced heavily because they would be bearing not just the weight of the roof, but the lateral pressure of several feet of earth pushing inward from 3 sides. The roof was a concrete shell as well, engineered to span the 40-foot width of the structure without intermediate supports, which meant the interior would be a single open space without columns interrupting the floor plan. On top of the concrete roof, once it had cured, they applied the waterproofing membrane, then a layer of rigid foam insulation 6 inches thick, then a drainage mat, then a geotextile fabric, and finally a minimum of 2 feet of soil that would eventually become a living roof planted with sedums and native grasses. The total weight on the roof structure was calculated carefully. Tom was not the kind of engineer who guessed. The south wall was where Sarah had spent most of her design energy. It was, in functional terms, the entire active face of the structure, the only surface through which the home would interact directly with the outside world. She had settled on a design that combined thermal mass with glazing in a ratio she had worked out through a calculation method developed in the 1970s called the solar load ratio method, which sounds technical but is essentially a way of figuring out how much window area you need relative to how much floor area you're trying to heat, adjusted for your climate, your latitude, and the thermal storage capacity of your walls and floors. For their location in western Montana, at roughly 46 degrees north latitude, with a heating degree day count that made conventional builders wince, she calculated that she needed approximately 240 square feet of south-facing glazing to provide meaningful solar gain, with a thermal mass volume sufficient to store that gain and release it slowly enough to prevent overheating during sunny days and keep temperatures stable through cloudy stretches. The glazing was triple pane, chosen for its insulating value rather than just its transmittance, because a south window in Montana is doing 2 jobs simultaneously, letting solar energy in during the day and preventing heat loss at night. Standard double pane windows lose more heat overnight than they gain during a short winter day in a marginal climate. Triple pane windows shift that equation meaningfully. They installed motorized insulating shades on the interior of every window, thick cellular shades that deployed automatically at sunset and retracted at sunrise, adding a final layer of resistance against nighttime heat loss. The thermal mass inside the structure was, by any conventional standard, excessive. The concrete floor slab was 6 inches thick rather than the standard 4, colored dark to maximize solar absorption, and left uncovered except in the sleeping area where they laid stone tile for comfort. The interior walls were built from a combination of rammed earth and compressed earth blocks that Dale had made himself over the course of 2 summers using soil from the excavation mixed with a small percentage of Portland cement for stabilization. The process of making compressed earth blocks had started as an economy measure, since manufactured rammed earth products are expensive, and had become something Dale cared about with an intensity that occasionally alarmed her. He had built a small hydraulic press from plans he found online, mixed and tested batches of soil at different moisture contents and compression ratios, and eventually produced blocks that were more uniform and more consistent than anything she had seen in photographs of professionally built earthen structures. He was, she had come to understand after a decade together, a person who did things all the way or not at all. Those walls stored heat with a patience that no conventional building material could match. The specific heat capacity of compressed earth is lower than water but higher than wood, and the density of the material means that a 12-inch thick wall represents a thermal flywheel of considerable mass, absorbing heat slowly during the day without ever getting hot enough to be uncomfortable to touch, and releasing it equally slowly through the night. The effect in practice is that the interior temperature of a well-designed earth-sheltered structure doesn't so much change as it drifts, moving through a range of perhaps 4 or 5 degrees over a 24-hour period rather than the 15 or 20 degrees that a conventional well-insulated house might experience between a cold night and a sunny afternoon. They moved in on a Thursday in late October, which was, in retrospect, the ideal time. The structure hadn't been lived in yet, which meant its thermal mass hadn't fully charged to living temperature. The floor was cool underfoot, and the walls felt faintly damp with the chill of recent construction. Dale built a fire in the small wood stove they had installed not as a primary heating system, but as a comfort measure, a single cast-iron stove with a capacity of about 40,000 BTU that they agreed they would use only for pleasure or genuine emergency. He used half a dozen pieces of dry pine and a small amount of kindling. The fire burned for about 3 hours, and Sarah sat on the floor of the main living space and watched the light change and felt the house begin, very slowly, to decide what its temperature was going to be. That first winter was a winter of measurement. She had installed a network of small wireless temperature sensors throughout the structure. 3 in the main living space at different heights and positions, 1 embedded in the rammed earth wall, 1 on the surface of the concrete floor, 1 in the ceiling, and 1 outside in a shaded position to record ambient outdoor temperatures. She checked the readings every morning with the focus of someone conducting an experiment, which she was. The outside temperatures that winter were, by Montana standards, unremarkable and occasionally vicious. There were 8 days in January when the overnight low dropped below -20 Fahrenheit. There were stretches of a week or more with no direct sunshine at all, the sky locked down under a uniform gray that absorbed whatever pale light the winter sun attempted and returned nothing useful to the earth below. During those cloudy weeks, the interior temperature would decline very slowly, dropping perhaps half a degree per day in the main living space. If a cloudy stretch lasted 10 days, which it occasionally did, the interior temperature at the end of those 10 days would be perhaps 5 degrees cooler than at the beginning. At no point during that first winter did the interior temperature of the main living space fall below 64 degrees Fahrenheit. At no point, regardless of what was happening outside, did it fall below 61. The floor surface temperature, which Sarah tracked as a separate measurement because it was the most immediately felt indication of comfort, never fell below 58 degrees. The rammed earth wall maintained a surface temperature that stayed within 2 degrees of the interior air temperature at all times, which meant there was none of the radiant chill that makes a conventionally insulated house feel cold even when the thermostat reads 68. That phenomenon of standing near a window or an exterior wall and feeling the cold radiating toward you even through insulation. On clear days in January, the house would warm itself. This was the part that never stopped feeling slightly miraculous to her, even after she understood the physics completely. The low winter sun would clear the mountain horizon at around 9 in the morning and immediately begin striking the south, facing glazing at an angle that delivered it nearly perpendicular to the glass, which is the optimal angle for solar transmission. By 11 in the morning, the living space would have gained 3 or 4 degrees. By 2 in the afternoon, on a clear day, the interior temperature in the main living space would reach between 72 and 76 degrees Fahrenheit without any supplemental heating of any kind. She would open the roof vents to let some of that heat escape, because overheating a house with that much thermal mass is something to be avoided, as the mass will store the excess warmth and release it slowly, driving interior temperatures higher than comfortable for days afterward if you let them get away from you in the first place. The wood stove was lit, by her count, 9 times that first winter. 7 of those times were for pleasure, on evenings when she and Dale wanted the specific quality of warmth and light that only a wood fire provides, the dancing shadows and the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of the draft pulling in the chimney. 2 of those times were practical, in January during the longest cloudy stretch, when the interior temperature had drifted down to 64 degrees and she wanted to bring it back up rather than wait for the sun. They burned, in total, perhaps 1/3 of a cord of wood. For comparison, the double-wide trailer they had vacated used between 4 and 5 cords of wood per winter, supplemented by an electric resistance baseboard system that she tried not to think about when the monthly power bills arrived. The number that became the one she quoted to everyone who asked, and people asked constantly once word spread through their small community that the buried house on the hill was staying warm without heat, was 86 degrees. That was the peak interior temperature recorded on the warmest clear day in February, when the sun angle was already beginning to climb and the glazing was capturing maximum solar radiation, when the thermal mass had been charging steadily for several days of clear weather, and when the house had, in some sense, found its stride. 86 degrees required the roof vents to be opened immediately, and the insulating shades on the east windows to be deployed to prevent further gain, but it was real, and it was produced entirely by sunlight passing through glass and being absorbed by dark concrete and compressed earth. No fire, no electric resistance, no propane, nothing burned. The sun hit the glass, and the house got warm the way it has always gotten warm when you dig into a south-facing hillside and arrange the opening correctly. Dale, characteristically, became more interested in the food production aspects of the project than in the thermal performance data. He had extended the south wall slightly beyond the main living space on the eastern end to create what he called an attached growing space, though it was, functionally, a lean-to greenhouse that benefited from the thermal mass of the earth's sheltered wall behind it. In that space, throughout the winter, he grew lettuce and spinach and arugula and several varieties of herbs, not in any abundance that would have fed them entirely, but in quantities that provided fresh salads through January and February, in a climate where that would otherwise have been impossible without a heated greenhouse. The growing space stayed consistently warmer than any freestanding greenhouse structure, because its north wall was the concrete south face of the earth-sheltered house, which released stored heat slowly throughout the night and kept the growing space from experiencing the dangerous temperature drops that kill cold, sensitive plants in unheated structures. Their neighbors' reactions ranged from admiring to skeptical to mildly evangelical. One neighbor, a rancher named Harold, who had lived on the adjacent property for 40 years and regarded most innovations with a suspicion refined by experience, came over in December to look at the house and stood in the main living space for a long time in his coat before taking his coat off, which Sarah later decided was the most meaningful review the house received. Harold said very little. He walked around the perimeter, noted that there was no visible furnace, touched the rammed earth wall with his palm the way you touch a radiator to test whether it's on, and remarked that it felt like being inside a hill. She told him that was more or less accurate. He looked out the south, facing windows at the mountains and the last light fading gold over the snow, and said, quietly and without sentimentality, that whoever built the first house this way probably figured it out by accident. Sarah thought about that for a long time afterward. There were problems, of course. There are always problems, and the decision to build unconventionally means encountering problems that conventional builders have already solved, and that you must therefore solve yourself. The radon issue was the most serious. Radon, a naturally occurring radioactive gas that emanates from certain types of soil and rock, accumulates in earth-sheltered and basement structures more readily than in above-grade homes because there's more surface area in contact with the soil and less air exchange with the outside. Their land tested at a radon level of 6.2 picocuries per liter before construction, which was above the EPA action level of 4. They installed a subslab depressurization system during construction, which involved a network of perforated pipe beneath the foundation slab connected to a continuously running fan that drew air from beneath the slab and exhausted it above the roofline, preventing radon from accumulating inside. Post-construction testing showed interior levels of 1 picocuries per liter, well within the acceptable range. The fan consumed about 40 watts and ran continuously, which was a small but permanent addition to their electrical load. The ventilation question was one she had thought about more carefully than almost any other aspect of the design. Earth-sheltered homes are, by virtue of being buried in thermally stabilizing material, also somewhat isolated from the natural air infiltration that conventional homes rely on, however inefficiently, to stay fresh. A tightly sealed earth-sheltered home without mechanical ventilation will develop air quality problems relatively quickly, accumulating moisture, carbon dioxide, and various off-gassing compounds from building materials and human activity. She had installed a heat recovery ventilator, a device that draws fresh air into the structure while exhausting stale air, and transfers heat from the outgoing air to the incoming air so that ventilation doesn't require throwing away all the thermal energy the house has worked to accumulate. The unit she chose recovered about 85% of the heat from exhaust air, which meant that in a cold winter, the incoming fresh air arrived at around 50 degrees rather than at -15, requiring only a small additional heat input to bring it to comfortable temperature. The moisture management inside the structure required attention, particularly in the first 2 years, while the concrete and rammed earth walls continued their slow drying process. New concrete and new rammed earth both release significant moisture as they cure, and in a well-sealed structure that moisture has nowhere to go except into the air, which can push relative humidity to levels that encourage mold growth and create discomfort. They ran a dehumidifier through the first summer and most of the second winter, monitoring relative humidity and keeping it below 60%. By the third year, the walls had dried sufficiently that the heat recovery ventilator alone kept humidity within comfortable range without supplemental dehumidification. The second winter was warmer than the first, though the outside temperatures were not. What had changed was the thermal mass. The walls and floor had spent a full year cycling through temperatures, and the mass had developed what she thought of as a thermal personality, a set of established behaviors that made the house's responses to changing conditions more predictable and more stable. The minimum interior temperature in the main living space that second winter was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The wood stove was lit 4 times, 2 of those were for pleasure. By the third winter, they had stopped tracking the data obsessively, not because it had become uninteresting, but because it had become reliable in the way that the seasons themselves are reliable, which is to say that you still pay attention, but you no longer worry. The house did what the house did. The sun came through the south windows on clear days, and the interior temperature climbed pleasantly, and the thermal mass drank up the warmth and stored it for the nights and cloudy days to come. The temperature stayed, through all but the most extreme circumstances, between 66 and 76 degrees Fahrenheit without any heating system running, without any fire being lit, without anything burning at all. People came to see it in a steady trickle. Some were serious builders and designers who arrived with notebooks and measuring tapes and asked detailed questions about the drainage system and the specific heat capacity calculations and radon mitigation design. Others were curious neighbors or people who had heard about the house at a community meeting or read a brief mention of it in the local paper. A few were people who were, like Sarah had once been, standing at the beginning of a long considering, trying to decide whether to take something seriously that seemed, on the surface, too simple to be true. To those last people she tried to say what her grandmother had said, though she said it differently and with more explanation. She told them that the earth had been managing temperature for a very long time before anyone built a house on it, and that the act of building a house into the earth rather than on top of it was not an innovation so much as a reorientation, a decision to work with a system that already existed rather than imposing a new system against it. The conventional house sits on the earth and fights the cold with fire. The earth's sheltered house sits in the earth and borrows the stability the earth has spent all year accumulating. Both approaches get you through the winter. One of them requires burning things continuously. The other requires paying attention carefully once, at the beginning, and then trusting the math. She told them also about the moment she had found most surprising in the entire project, which was not the first winter's data, or the summer temperatures, or any of the measurable outcomes. It was a morning in the 2nd February when she woke before Dale and walked out into the main living space in bare feet on the concrete floor and stood looking south through the triple pane glass at a landscape completely covered in snow, the temperature outside -12 according to the outdoor sensor, the mountains white and pink in the first light, and felt the floor warm under her feet and the air on her arms comfortable and mild, and understood with a clarity that numbers alone cannot provide that she was living inside something the earth had agreed to be responsible for. Not the structure she and Dale had built. The earth itself, 6 feet of patient stone and soil wrapped around their little house, was doing the work. It had been doing this work, Sarah thought, since before there were houses to do it for. All they had done was ask it properly. She thought about her grandmother then, as she sometimes did in moments that felt like arrivals. Elsa had been dead for 11 years. She had lived her whole life in a conventional house, burning wood and oil through Vermont winters with the determination of someone who does not question the available options. But she had known the warm earth under the leaves. She had told a 7-year-old girl about it as though it were a fact worth knowing, even if the knowing led nowhere in particular. Sarah stood in her bare feet on her warm floor in February with the sun coming up over the frozen mountains, and thought that perhaps that was how it always went. Knowledge passed forward without a specific destination, waiting for someone to find a use for it 30 years later on a south-facing slope in Montana. The house has been standing now for 6 winters. The rammed earth walls have darkened with time to a color that reminds her of old river stone. The living roof has filled in with sedums and wild grasses that turn bright gold in October and stay silver through the winter, giving the impression, from a distance, that the hillside has simply arranged itself into a comfortable shape. Dale has expanded the growing space twice and now grows tomatoes through the summer in a section that stays reliably 10 degrees warmer than the outdoor ambient due to its proximity to the south wall, which stores summer heat and releases it into the growing space through the night. They installed a small solar array on the south-facing roof extension over the growing space 3 years ago, and their average monthly electric bill is now $6, representing the fixed connection fee to the grid and nothing more. Harold the rancher came back the previous winter during a cold snap that brought 3 days of -25 and sat in their kitchen drinking coffee while outside the world contracted with cold, and inside the kitchen it was 70 degrees and Sarah was in a light sweater. He sat for a while without saying anything, which was his way of saying a great deal, and then he said that his grandfather had built a root cellar into a hillside in Nebraska in 1924 and had told him once that the earth down there never froze, not even in the worst winters, not even when everything on the surface was solid for 4 feet down. He said he had never thought to wonder, when his grandfather said that, what it would be like to live inside that place instead of just storing potatoes in it. Sarah refilled his coffee and didn't say anything, because sometimes the right response to a thing someone has understood is simply to let them have the understanding without interruption. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -27. Inside, the rammed earth walls stood warm and dense and patient. The concrete floor held the day's solar gain in its quiet chemistry. The house breathed slowly through its heat recovery ventilator and asked nothing from anyone, and in the ceiling sensor, the temperature read exactly what it had read the night before, and the night before that, and every night since October when the long charging of summer had finished and the house had settled, once again, into the steady warmth it borrowed from the earth and had no intention of returning.